2018 was going to be a bad year for the Seattle Seahawks. It was going to be a lost season, a rebuilding season, perhaps Pete Carroll's swan song. Who knows, maybe General Manager John Schneider's as well. Gone were so many notable faces from that legendary Legion of Boom defense. Michael Bennett and Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor. Now you turn around and all these recognizable faces that you've identified with that organization for over the past half decade are no longer in the fold, without a lot of star power to replace them. It's a reasonable thing to assume that this was going to be a lost rebuilding type of year. And it most certainly didn't help when this team went out to start the season, the Seahawks, and lost their first 2 road games. Starting off 0-2, losing your first 2 on the road, this team did not look like any real type of threat at all. Kind of hung around a little bit, but even when they got to the bye week, they were still only 3-3. And especially when she lost Earl Thomas to that season-ending injury and the memorable picture of him being carted off and flicking off Pete Carroll and the Seahawks sidelines. You looked at it, you're like, okay, now reality's going to set in and perhaps this team is going to get lost and they're going to start losing and come back to what we kind of expected them to be. And that never happened. Instead, the Seahawks found themselves. The Seahawks played better. They won 6 of their last 7 games to be able to get into the playoffs. 6 of their last 7 for a team that many of us probably thought would be lucky to win 6 games all year. I mean, that's the reality. Is they were thought to be a 5, 6, maybe 7-win team. They're going to be the 49ers and the Rams and all this. And then here come the freaking Seahawks. This was easily the best coaching job I've ever seen Pete Carroll do. I thought he deserved a lot more love when it came to Coach of the Year. Like, to me, I'm sorry. Obviously, nothing wrong with Matt Nagy getting Coach of the Year for a 12-win Bears team that won the division. But when you look at the momentum and where it was going for Matt Nagy heading into this season compared to where the momentum was heading on the opposite end of the spectrum for Pete Carroll, I thought along with Frank Reich that Pete Carroll deserved way more love for Coach of the Year. Because this was USC, Seattle, doesn't matter to me. This was his best coaching job. Who the hell thought that this was going to be a 10-win-ish team and make the playoffs? I most certainly did not. And a lot of other people didn't either. Like, this was impressive stuff. And how did they do it? Well, they did it by stemming the tide on defense. They weren't as good or great or elite as in previous years, but they were still middle of the pack. I mean, they were effective enough defensively. Bobby Wagner is a stud, a future Hall of Famer. Everybody knows he's elite at his position, and yet we never really talk about it. Does that make sense? Like, everybody recognizes he's a superstar. Everybody recognizes that maybe all these years later, he was actually the best player on that Legion of Boom defense. It was Bobby Wagner, not Richard Sherman or Earl Thomas or Cam Chancellor or Michael Bennett. He was that dude. And yet we seem to hardly talk about him. Yet Frank Clark had a massive year in the contract season, 13 sacks. And for crying out loud, Jerron Reed, who I liked quite a bit coming out of Alabama, if you remember, but questioned his ability to get after the passer, which makes sense. He had 10.5 sacks. So it was like was next man up, and this team was able to figure out a way to piece it together and get things done. They did it on the offensive side of the ball, too. They were the #1 rushing team in the NFL. Chris Carson was a revelation. Over 1,150 yards rushing, combined with Russell Wilson. You know, the crazy thing is they drafted a running back in Rashad Penny in the first round, and he was a bit of an afterthought compared to Chris Carson, who was that dude. That's what's crazy. Even the best laid plan, in this case, they took a running back in round 1, expecting to have finally replaced Marshawn Lynch, and they may have very well eventually replaced Marshawn Lynch, but it was with Chris Carson. Like, even when things don't work out as planned, they still figured out a way to make it work. That's insane to me. Just absolutely insane. And like I said, when you really take a look at this, this is one of these examples sometimes that you can have too much star power on one side of the ball or too much personality on one team in one locker room. And sometimes it can be a situation of addition by subtraction. And by getting rid of guys that are full of personality, and Michael Bennett and Richard Sherman, and then obviously Cam Chancellor and his injury, and to a lesser degree, I would say Earl Thomas with his injury, maybe it's that you lost some of that personality out of that locker room because you really didn't notice that they were gone once you got into the heart of the season. So this team still played at a decent level. It was crazy. But again, good reminder. Sometimes you can have too much personality. They became perhaps a little too political in their locker room, a little too much griping. Frankly, they never truly, here's the thing, they never truly recovered from the Super Bowl loss with Russell Wilson throwing the pick to Malcolm Butler at the 1 yard line. That's the reality. And perhaps some of the moves that were made by allowing Richard Sherman to leave, by cutting him, by allowing Michael Bennett to leave, maybe these were moves that were made a year too late. Perhaps. So now when you look at this Seahawks team, what's next for them in the offseason? They've got about $50 million in salary cap space. Got to figure out what they're going to do with guys like Frank Clark and Earl Thomas. Is he done in a Seahawks uniform? Perhaps he'll go to Dallas. KJ Wright, J.R. Sweezy. The Seahawks have a little bit of money to play with here. Their number one priority, you would assume, is to retain Frank Clark, and you would most certainly expect, worst case scenario, he's going to get the franchise tag. I highly doubt he's allowed to go anywhere. But for a team that was up against the cap really, really bad, now you come out of it a year or two later, you've got cap space, you've got a team coming off of a playoff appearance. Things aren't as bad as they looked like they could be Seahawks at one point in time. But they've got some more work to do because you wonder if 2018 was more of an aberration than what they could really be.
They're going to have to make some improvements on this roster. Number one, they're going to have to get a playmaking tight end. I know this offense is built around having a great inline blocker and skip and whoop-de-woo, but let's catch up to the modern NFL. You need to be able to have a guy that can threaten defenses over the middle in the intermediate areas, and the Seahawks really don't have that. I know there's going to be a lot of geeking out for Will Dissly, and you know what? He's a good player, but he's more blocker than he truly is receiving threat. I'm sorry, that's what it is. They could use another guy to go along with him because, again, I will remind everybody, there is nothing in the rules of the NFL that says you can't have two competent tight ends. You need another one. When you look at that secondary on the defensive side of the ball, they need some more young depth there. They could use a safety to potentially replace Earl Thomas, who I really wonder if they're going to bother retaining. And even if they do, you need somebody long-term to take over for him. They could use some more talent outside at corner. They still don't have that true number one shutdown guy, which is what their defense was built on for so many years. Also defensively, you look at it and you say, well, Frank Clark had a massive season. He'll certainly be brought back. But you could definitely use another impact rusher off of the edge because can you really count on Jerron Reed to give you 10.5 sacks up the middle again? I don't know about that. And then offensively, you look, I still feel like even though Tyler Lockett had a pretty good year and Baldwin had a bit of a down year, but still a really good player, they still could use another weapon on the outside as well. Because you still ultimately, as far as you're going to go as a team, is dependent upon what Russell Wilson is able to do or not do. And they need more talent around him than what they had. It was kind of patchwork in 2018. They got the job done. They adjusted to the personnel they had and minimized what they didn't. But now with the Seahawks, you've given Pete Carroll a contract extension. You've got a franchise quarterback in the prime of his career. You've got a defense built around a future Hall of Famer in Bobby Wagner. Shit, you never know. You get a couple of guys into the fold, this Seahawks team could be right back in the mix of being a championship contender next year.